What's up, everyone? It's Robert here. So here's something wild that most people don't realize. The system that lets you swipe a credit card, buy a house with a mortgage, or check your bank balance on your phone, it didn't exist for most of human history. And when it was finally invented, it wasn't created by some grand council of wise economists sitting in an ivory tower. Instead, it emerged from a messy, chaotic mix of desperate kings trying to fund wars, clever merchants trying to get around religious laws, and goldsmiths who accidentally stumbled into the business of creating money out of thin air. The story of how modern debt came to be is honestly stranger than fiction, and it involves some of the most powerful families in European history, financial bubbles that crashed entire economies, and innovations that literally reshaped civilization as we know it. By the end of this video, you're going to see money in a completely different way, and you'll understand why the chair you're sitting in, the house you live in, and basically everything around you exists because someone, somewhere along the line, figured out how to make debt work. Let's start at the beginning, because debt is way, way older than you might think. We're talking ancient Mesopotamia here, around 4,000 years ago. The cradle of civilization wasn't just inventing writing and agriculture. They were also inventing the fundamental concepts of credit and lending. In ancient Babylonia, temples functioned as the world's first banks. These were economic powerhouses that stored grain, lent to farmers, and kept meticulous records on clay tablets. Picture this. You're a farmer in ancient Sumer, and the harvest season is months away, but you need seed to plant. You go to the temple and the priests lend you grain based on what they expect you'll harvest later. They track everything on clay tablets with cuneiform script, creating one of humanity's first credit systems. If you couldn't pay back the loan, you might end up pledging your labor, or worse, becoming what they called a debt slave. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1700 BCE, actually had specific provisions about lending, interest rates, and collateral. It set limits on how much interest could be charged, with higher rates allowed for riskier loans, which sounds pretty familiar, right? Ancient Egypt had similar systems, using grain as a form of currency and operating what were essentially state-run banks under the Macedonian rulers by the 3rd century BCE. The Romans took things even further with the Argentarii, sophisticated bankers who took deposits, made loans, and even issued bills of exchange. They had all the basics of banking, which meant they also had the world's first banking crises, when things went sideways. But all these ancient systems were relatively straightforward. You borrowed something, you paid it back with interest. Modern debt is a whole different animal, and to understand how we got there, we need to jump forward about 1,000 years to medieval Italy. By the Middle Ages, Europe had a massive problem. The Catholic Church, which basically controlled every aspect of life, had declared that charging interest on loans, called usury, was a mortal sin. This created a nightmare for anyone who wanted to do business, because without the ability to make money from lending money, why would anyone lend at all? Enter the Italian merchants, who were about to get extremely creative with the rules. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became powerhouses of trade, and merchants needed ways to move money safely across vast distances and to finance their ventures. Jewish moneylenders had been one solution, since they weren't bound by Christian usury laws. But that wasn't enough to fuel the commercial revolution that was brewing, so Italian merchants invented workarounds. Instead of charging interest directly, they used something called discounting. Here's how it worked. Instead of lending you 100 florins and charging you interest, they'd give you 90 florins now, and you'd pay back 100 later. The difference wasn't interest, see? It was a discount for immediate payment. Technically, this didn't violate usury laws, or at least that's what they told themselves. They also used bills of exchange, which were essentially promises to pay in a different currency in a different city at a different time. By playing with exchange rates and timing, they could hide what was effectively interest in the currency conversion. The Italian Lombards and French cohorcins became famous for these techniques in the 13th and 14th centuries. They set up benches in the great trading piazzas, which is where we get the word bank from, banco, meaning bench. When a trader couldn't pay his debts, they'd break his bench, giving us the term bankruptcy, from bancarota, or broken bench. These were fundamental innovations that made long-distance trade possible. Without them, the commercial revolution that lifted Europe out of the Dark Ages simply couldn't have happened. But if you want to talk about the family that really revolutionized banking and debt, you got to talk about the Medici. In 1397, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici established what would become the largest bank Europe had ever seen. And in the process, his family would reshape not just finance, but art, politics, and the entire trajectory of Western civilization. The Medici Bank pioneered practices that we still use today. They popularized double-entry bookkeeping, where every transaction is recorded as both a debit and a credit, creating a system of checks and balances that made fraud much harder and accounting much more accurate. This might sound boring, but it was revolutionary. For the first time, banks could track complex webs of transactions across multiple cities and keep accurate records of what they owed and what was owed to them. But the Medici's real genius was the letter of credit. Imagine you're a merchant traveling from London to Florence. Carrying thousands of gold coins is dangerous. You might get robbed, and the coins are heavy and inconvenient. Instead, you deposit your florins at a Medici bank in London and receive a letter of credit. When you arrive in Florence, you present that letter at the Medici bank there, and you receive local currency. Sounds simple, right? The clever part is that the exchange rates between cities were different, and by manipulating those rates slightly, the Medici could charge what was effectively interest without technically violating usury laws. A florin in London might exchange at a rate of 40 pence, while in Florence it might be 36 pence. That 4 pence difference, that was the Medici's profit, disguised as a currency exchange. This gave them annual returns as high as 22%, all while maintaining the appearance of not charging interest. The Medici also invented the holding company model. At their peak, they had branches in Milan, Venice, Rome, London, Geneva, Lyon, Avignon, Barcelona, and Bruges. Each branch was a partnership held under a central holding company in Florence, allowing them to coordinate operations across Europe while spreading risk. This network made them unbelievably wealthy and powerful. Under Cosimo de' Medici and later Lorenzo the Magnificent, the bank financed popes, kings, and emperors. Cosimo was so powerful that Pope Pius II said of him, "He is king in everything but name." The wealth generated by their banking operations funded the Renaissance itself. The Medici bankrolled Donatello, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Botticelli. They paid for the dome of Florence Cathedral, one of the great engineering marvels of the age. The art and architecture they sponsored defined an entire era of human achievement. But the Medici Bank eventually collapsed in 1494, brought down by bad loans to English royalty during the Wars of the Roses, political instability, and mismanagement under Lorenzo. Yet their innovations lived on, spreading throughout Europe and laying the groundwork for modern banking. While the Medici were revolutionizing banking in Italy, something even more fundamental was happening in London, something that would completely transform what money actually meant. In the 17th century, London goldsmiths were craftsmen who made jewelry and candlesticks from precious metals. They had strong vaults to protect their inventory, and soon, wealthy Londoners started paying goldsmiths to store their gold coins for safekeeping. When you deposited gold, the goldsmith would give you a receipt specifying how much gold you had stored. Simple enough, right? But then, these receipts started circulating as a form of payment themselves. Why go to the trouble of retrieving your gold, transporting it across town, and then having the recipient deposit it with their own goldsmith? Much easier to just hand over the receipt. The recipient could either redeem it for gold or use it to pay someone else. These receipts became, in effect, paper money. This is where things get really interesting. The goldsmiths noticed something crucial. Most of the gold sitting in their vaults was never redeemed. People were happy trading receipts, and only occasionally did someone come to withdraw actual gold. So the goldsmiths started issuing more receipts than they had gold to back them up. If a goldsmith had 1,000 pounds of gold in his vault, he might issue receipts for 5,000 pounds, lending out those excess receipts to borrowers and charging interest. This practice, which sounds suspiciously like fraud, and probably was at first, became fractional reserve banking, the foundation of every modern banking system on Earth. Let's walk through how this worked. Say John Smith deposits 1,000 pounds in gold with a goldsmith, who gives him a receipt and promises to guard it safely. The goldsmith might charge a small fee for this service, or eventually, he might even pay interest to attract more deposits. Now Fred Brown comes along and wants to borrow money. The goldsmith writes him a receipt for 1,000 pounds, even though that gold is supposedly sitting in the vault belonging to John Smith. Fred takes his receipt, uses it to buy merchandise, and a year later pays back 1,000 pounds plus interest. The goldsmith has made real money from creating a receipt backed by nothing, at least nothing beyond his promise that he could produce gold if Fred demanded it. The system worked because not everyone demanded their gold at the same time. As long as people had faith in the receipts, they functioned as money, and the goldsmith could issue far more receipts than he had gold in reserve. The cash reserve ratios varied wildly, from as low as 10% to as high as 66%, depending on how confident or how reckless the goldsmith was. What makes this so profound is that these goldsmiths were creating money out of thin air. The receipts circulating as currency represented credit, not actual gold. They were promises to pay, and as long as everyone believed those promises, the system expanded the money supply far beyond the physical gold that existed. This was a complete reimagining of what money could be. Money was no longer just a physical commodity. It was trust, belief, and credit all rolled into one. Of course, this system had a massive vulnerability. If depositors lost faith and everyone tried to redeem their receipts at once, the goldsmith would be ruined. This phenomenon, called a bank run, destroyed many early banks and led to financial panics that rippled through the economy. The goldsmiths who survived were those who managed their reserves prudently and maintained public confidence. By the late 17th century, this system of fractional reserve banking, credit creation, and paper money had become established in London, creating a model that would spread throughout the world. The goldsmith bankers showed that banks could create credit, but there was one type of borrower who could really put this system to the test: governments at war. Wars cost unimaginable amounts of money, far more than any king could raise through taxes alone. This is where government debt, as we know it today, was born, and it happened in 1694 with the founding of the Bank of England. King William III needed £1.5 million to expand the Royal Navy to fight France, but traditional lenders weren't interested in taking on that risk. A Scottish banker named William Paterson proposed something revolutionary: create a private bank that would handle government debt by issuing negotiable bonds, both short-term and long-term. The bank would be privately owned, putting shareholders' capital at risk, which made them more prudent and more trustworthy than the king himself. Charles II had suspended payments on his bills back in 1672, an event called the Great Stop of the Exchequer, so nobody trusted the crown to repay its debts. But a private bank subject to legal oversight and run by merchants with their own money on the line, that was different. Parliament chartered the Bank of England, which loaned the government £1.2 million at 8% annual interest. In return, the bank received a royal charter, the right to issue banknotes, and long-term banking privileges. This created something unprecedented: government debt that was tradable, reliable, and backed by a credible institution. The interest rate on British government bonds soon declined to levels far below what France, which continued borrowing the old-fashioned way from individual bankers, had to pay. This gave Britain a secret weapon in its endless wars with France. As Cicero had said 2,000 years earlier, "The sinews of war are infinite money," and Britain now had a system that could generate infinite money through debt. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain's national debt had reached £1 billion, more than 200% of GDP. But Britain had won almost every war with France and emerged as the world's foremost military and commercial power. The Bank of England's model of government debt sparked imitation and innovation across Europe. France tried its own version under John Law in 1720, attempting to swap the entire stock of government debt for shares in the Mississippi Company. That experiment ended in spectacular failure with the Mississippi Bubble, but it demonstrated how powerful and dangerous these new financial instruments could be. Britain also had its own financial disaster with the South Sea Company in 1720, when a frenzy of speculation drove stock prices to insane levels before the bubble burst. But despite these crises, the fundamental model held: governments could borrow vast sums by issuing tradable bonds backed by their future tax revenues. This transformed warfare, commerce, and the power dynamics between nations. Countries that mastered government debt financing could project military power far beyond what their current resources allowed, building empires and shaping history. Where does this leave us? By the 19th century, all the pieces of modern debt were in place. You had fractional reserve banking creating credit and expanding the money supply. You had government bonds that allowed states to borrow against future taxes. You had international networks of banks that could move money across borders and facilitate global trade. And you had central banks, starting with the Bank of England but spreading to Sweden, France, and eventually around the world, that could regulate this system and serve as lenders of last resort during panics. The Industrial Revolution couldn't have happened without this financial infrastructure. Factories, railroads, steamships, all of it required massive upfront capital that only a sophisticated credit system could provide. Entrepreneurs could borrow against future profits, investors could buy bonds and stocks that represented claims on future earnings, and the entire economy could grow far beyond what the existing supply of physical money would allow. In the 20th century, this system was refined and expanded. The United States established the Federal Reserve in 1913, creating a true central bank. The gold standard was eventually abandoned, making money entirely a matter of trust and government backing rather than tied to physical commodities. Deposit insurance was created to prevent bank runs. International institutions like the World Bank and the IMF emerged to manage sovereign debt across borders. Today, the system has reached a level of complexity that would be unrecognizable to a Medici banker or a London goldsmith. We have credit default swaps, mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, cryptocurrencies, and algorithmic trading. The shadow banking system operates outside traditional regulations, creating credit through vehicles that aren't technically banks. Global debt, both public and private, has reached levels that would have seemed impossible just a few generations ago. But underneath all that complexity, the fundamental principles remain the same ones invented centuries ago. Fractional reserves creating money through lending, government bonds funding public spending, and the entire system resting on trust and belief that promises will be honored. The goldsmiths who first issued more receipts than they had gold in their vaults. The Italian merchants who invented workarounds to usury laws. The Medici who built a banking empire across Europe. The founders of the Bank of England who made government debt reliable. They're all part of a story that led directly to the world we live in today. Without the invention of modern debt, there's no industrial revolution, no global trade as we know it, no mortgages or credit cards, no way for governments to fund infrastructure or respond to crises. For better or worse, and there are definitely arguments on both sides, modern debt enabled the creation of modern civilization. Okay, so next time you check your bank balance or pay for something with a card, remember, you're participating in a system that was invented by people trying to solve very practical problems like how to move money safely, how to fund wars, and how to make a profit while technically obeying religious laws against usury. It's a system built on human ingenuity, occasional fraud, frequent crises, and ultimately on the strangest thing of all, trust between strangers separated by time and space, trust that promises will be kept and debts will be honored. That trust, fragile and imperfect as it is, made the modern world possible. If you found this deep dive into financial history interesting, smash that like button, subscribe, drop a comment, and let me know what financial topic you want me to tackle next. Peace.